My sense of the way that the Charter of Quebec Values was presented to us was one based on anecdote. I think a lot of the justification that we've heard in the media has been very much anecdotal about particular kinds of isolated incidents. And I think anecdote only takes us so far. I think if we're thinking about the way that culture works, we'd really have to move beyond anecdote, a pure reliance on anecdote, to think more systematically, more structurally about what's going on fundamentally underneath the messages that we've heard. So the way I like to think about culture is it's an informal definition, but it's as a set of stories. It's a set of stories that we tell one another that circulate within culture and that allow us to understand our role in the world and to allow us to understand how we relate to one another and to make meaning in terms of our own lives. Based on that definition of culture, culture being a very complex thing, but that's one informal definition of it, I think it's really important that we think about the kinds of stories that circulate, where those stories come from, who they're addressed to, who's speaking in terms of those kinds of messages, how often we hear them, and what the sum total of those messages is for us as a culture. So if culture is a set of stories, it's also about the power to represent the world around us. And I think it's very, very important that we know, and I'm thinking of theorists such as Stuart Hall and Richard Dyer in this particular instance, that representations of people in the media have profound practical consequences for the way that they're treated in life. So there is a direct relationship between the kinds of cultural stories that circulate and the ways in which people experience their lives, the way they are treated in life, which I think is a very important connection to make when we think about the Charter of Quebec Values.
So we're at a really remarkable moment in Quebec on many fronts, and I think this story speaks to many issues at once. And I want to focus especially on this conception of the whole project of furthering the interests of the neutrality of the state and its public service, and at the same time to enshrine gender equality. And the ways in which this project in particular has focused on what are called in French les signes ostentatoires, conspicuous signs, and the ways that these in particular are constructed as threats to both state neutrality and gender equality.
Issues like the Charter emerge from this strive or this sort of attempt to mobilize sentiments, and one has to ask critically against whom. Who is included in the Charter and who is excluded? What are the conditions or criteria by which one becomes included?
In fact, equality and neutrality protect certain subjects over others, and the Charter's affirmation of our values already presumes who those subjects are.
I think that it's important that we then ask, so what is the work that this proposed Charter is supposed to do? If, in fact, there's no imminent concern, if there's no popular record of necessity for what exactly, and if it's in the end going to violate the existing rights, which are clear and extensive, what work does it do? Right? Why is this being introduced? Why is this being proposed? And I think that's where you start to get to the kernel of the kind of ideological and political project that the proposed Charter has embarked upon.
The Charter was announced in September of 2013, and what it does basically, or what it proposes, is that anyone wearing a religious sign, or an ostentatious religious sign as it's been called or identified, would not be able to work in the public sector. And so this includes, as ostentatious symbols are turbans, hijabs, face veils, kippas, yarmulkes are considered ostentatious signs. And also larger than average crosses. Anything that is considered an acceptable sign would be a cross that is smaller, or a crescent as they've been identified, or a Star of David that is small. So those are kind of the symbols that are acceptable and the symbols that are unacceptable.
It's basically creating a kind of state-sanctioned form of racism as well, just even in the proposed legislation.
We really focused on a cross-section of members of the Communication Studies Department. We looked to professors, we looked to students, and so what you will see is people who come at this from a range of different research perspectives, asking questions about the Charter. And more importantly, asking questions about the discourses around the Charter. It's the fall of 2013, and we can't anticipate exactly where this law will go. But the point is, at this exact time, we can say that it is creating discourses across the province and across the country that have consequences. And it's these consequences that we have tried to unpack and tried to contribute questions to.
So in thinking about the movement, or better yet, the Charter, my question is, how are we witnessing this? And I use that term intentionally, witness. How are we witnessing it? Whether we are a Muslim woman, or we're a communication scholar, or we're part of the officials that are determining whether or not this will be passed, this bill. And I think about Stuart Hall and his understanding of popular culture. And he says it's like a field, and there's different players on this field. But in the case of the Charter, I'm not necessarily saying that these players, we need to know whose team they're on, but more so which players are being legitimized to play.
Idle No More immediately, as soon as the Charter became like a public conversation, issued, it was Idle No More Quebec specifically, issued a declaration of like rejecting this Charter and seeing it as an absolutely negative thing, and they were advocating for discourses that don't create othering and that don't create a fear of the other. And so I think, like, again, like emphasizing these positive moments where we can get back to and sort of release this tension that's created by this very polarizing discourse, this very polarizing Charter that supposes that we can't talk. It's like, no, but we can. So.
Religious dress cannot simply be reduced to a surface of signs. When we think, for example, of the complex ways that, take the example of the Sikh turban, the complex ways that this particular form of bodily practice is implicated in a range of everyday habits, but also more fundamentally, in this case of the turban, when we think about one of the reasons why Sikhs wear turbans is because they do not cut their hair. And so the ways in which the wearing of the turban is connected to a whole other realm of bodily practices that leads to questions saying, like, how can we remove the sign would also somehow leave this curiously practical problem of what will be done about the hair. Does this mean that the hair too should be cut? So how far will the state actually go in the removal of these signs? And so the ways in which religious dress becomes reduced to questions of claims making in the public sphere, and that it serves as a stand-in for forms of personal conviction that somehow are supposed to be detached from the religious signs, or should be detached from this public sphere, I think is really requires some careful thinking.
Within that sort of like notion of the private and public sphere, one of the big things is that in fact religious beliefs can be carved up in that way. It's like saying you can work for the city of Montreal as long as you don't wear a hijab, which is one of the things that the Charter stipulates. But you can then go home and wear your hijab. But if you're at work, you can't. Now that presupposes that anybody wearing a hijab or a turban or a kippah or anything else that sort of signifies their religious affiliation is somehow incapable of making of differentiating between when is a time for practice and when is it a time of carrying that in an internalized way within.
And it creates all kinds of other incredible practical considerations. What about somebody wearing a large cross on a t-shirt, or if you have a tattoo? What about dreadlocks? Are those religious dreadlocks or secular dreadlocks? Or is a man wearing a beard a Muslim beard or a Jewish beard, or is it a secular beard? And one can go on and on with this remarkable task of parsing the distinction between religious and non-religious signs. And so again, it reminds us of the ways in which these embodied practices are ultimately irreducible to the surface of signs that the Quebec government wishes to advocate the removal of.
Part of my own training, apart from being in media and cultural studies, is in graphic design. And I was particularly interested in the way that the Charter of Quebec Values was presented, in one instance on the website, as a chart, as a graphic. And I think there's something very, very interesting and kind of troubling going on about that graphic, which is what I want to talk about. Now, the first thing that strikes me in terms of the way that this graphic is presented is it's in the style of what we might call an infographic or information graphic. It's the kind of style that we would encounter in very neutral situations. Let's say, for instance, the safety card on an aeroplane, the instruction manual for a piece of IKEA furniture, maybe even for Lego or Mega Blocks. It's something that has the look, the sense of being absolutely and eminently reasonable and absolutely culturally neutral. But we only have to think for a little bit more deeply about the one that's presented on the website to realize that there's something else going on here. So when we look at the graphic, there's a few things that we can take away from that I think are kind of problematic. So the first one is that it is in the style of, it speaks the language of information graphics, which is supposed to be a very neutral kind of way of presenting objective information. And this is not the case with this particular graphic. So next thing is that information graphics most often take us from something that has been a current situation and a situation we would like to find our way to. So in the sense of IKEA or Lego, we start with a bunch of pieces and hopefully we end up with a piece of furniture at the end. If we think about a safety card in an aeroplane, for instance, heaven forbid, it starts with, here we are sitting happily on an aeroplane and something terrible happens and we all find our way through the emergency exit, and then we all survive whatever catastrophe has befallen the aeroplane based on this sequence. So it's a time-based sequence of events. I think what's peculiar about the graphic as presented on the website is that it's not a before and after, it's sort of an after and a before, which makes me really wonder about the language that's being spoken, the graphic language that's being spoken in this thing. Why would it be that we would start with one panel that shows us how things may be in the future, what the desirable outcome is, with these much smaller markers of religious affiliation, religious belief. But then the second and final panel is, I guess, the status quo right now. Perhaps if it was reversed, if it really did go from what's happening now to what we think should happen in the future, it would actually trigger a more kind of defensive kind of response on our own part. It would be seen to be more inflammatory than it's pretending to be. So I think that's a problem right there.
One of the things that I find troubling about the Charter is the manner in which I think it appropriates feminist discourse of equality between women and men to argue for what they call affirming our values, right, nos valeurs. And I think this gesture of appropriation, of the appropriation of feminism, has many historical precedents, as well as a lot of contemporary examples that are coextensive with the Charter. The history of the appropriation of feminism, or of the discourse of saving women, has roots in colonialism, and particularly in early colonial administrations that attempted to ban cultural practices like sati, widow burning in India, or the veil in Algeria. And particularly such practices, the ban on such practices served to bolster the colonizers' language of a civilizing discourse, right, through a practice that the theorist Gatry Spivak calls white men saving brown women from brown men, right? But that practice of bolstering nationalism, and often a largely kind of racist or xenophobic nationalism, has a lot of current examples. So, for example, in the US in the post-9/11 period, the Bush administration used the language of women's rights and women's equality to justify the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan by talking specifically about saving Afghani women from the Taliban. And Laura Bush used radio addresses where she talked specifically about the threat of invisibility in order to make a kind of collapse between the threats of the terrorists, who were largely invisible, the threats of an oppressive regime like the Taliban, and the threats of the veil to women, right? So there was a kind of interesting collapse that she was mobilizing there. And similarly in France, Nicolas Sarkozy declared the burqa and the niqab an affront to Republican values, right? Arguing that these garments had no place in Islam, that they were a threat to gender equality, that they marginalized women, that they endangered public safety because terrorists could use them to hide their identity, right? So again, the collapses of security, terrorism, and women's rights were mobilized there. And apart from the remarkable hubris that had Sarkozy declare himself authoritatively on questions of Islam, the actual discourses that Sarkozy mobilized were hiding the ways in which Sarkozy was making an appeal to supporters of the Front National in articulating a new French national identity. And in fact, it's only following that rhetoric that André Guérin, who was the chairman of the parliamentary committee tasked with formulating the ban, shifted the debate to questions of secularism, of laïcité. And he argued at that point in time that wearing a veil was the tip of the iceberg of those, quote, seeking to export a radical brand of Islamic fundamentalism to France, right? So what began as a kind of appeal to a far-right nationalist group in France turned into a kind of justificatory discourse around secularism and civility. And I think the Quebec Charter repeats this logic of saving brown women from brown men by affirming something like our values in the same kind of civilizing discourse in the face of what they call the confusion or the discomfort in Quebec around religious accommodation. So one of the things that the letter by Les Jeannettes articulated was that veiled women today are like women in Quebec before the Révolution tranquille. And so the resistance to the Charter is a threat, in their words, of a return to the past. This notion that certain women are backward compared to other women has been called by theorists the denial of coevalness, right? The idea that different cultures and different people are not in spaces of difference, but are actually backward or more advanced in a singular arc of history. So the accusation here is that, in fact, feminist assertions within the Muslim community are either false representatives being coerced by their community, sent against their will to strengthen patriarchal religious principles, or misappropriations of feminist discourses of choice. So women who assert equality can assert questions of choice, but women who choose to wear the veil can't. And they can't because the choice to wear the veil can't be a proper choice because it's a return to the past in this vision of progress and advancement, which fits into this discourse of civilizing and civilizing. And so I think we should be suspicious about the claims to equality and neutrality that are mobilized in and through the Charter, and to think about the ways in which certain forms of equality that the Charter articulates are in some ways more equal than others, right? And the discourse of equality and of neutrality actually shores up very narrow visions of nationalism by refusing the intersections of gender, race, ethnicity, religious identity, class, and contemporary Quebec society. Un exemple très important de la mobilisation du discours soi-disant féministe, je pense, c'est la lettre ouverte qui a été écrite par un groupe de féministes très connus au Québec, qui s'appelle soi-disant les Jeannettes, qui soutiennent la Charte des valeurs. Ceci inclut Jeannette Bertrand, Denise Filiatro, Julie Snyder, Jamila Benhabib, Denise Robert et beaucoup d'autres femmes. La lettre a été publiée dans Le Devoir, le Journal de Montréal, la presse, qui s'adresse aux femmes du Québec, donc un groupe de femmes adressées par la lettre, qui dit que la Charte a le potentiel de donner fin à l'inégalité du genre. La lettre est très remarquable parce qu'elle commence avec une adresse de la première personne. Je me suis battue. Cette figure du féminisme, c'est en fait la figure de Jeannette Bertrand elle-même. La lettre essaie d'affirmer en fait que l'égalité est de fait au Québec. La lettre dit « J'ai toujours pensé que si nous voulions garder cette égalité, il fallait être vigilante. » Donc l'égalité est entre les hommes et les femmes, et non pas entre les femmes. Et cette égalité entre les hommes et les femmes doit être défendue avec vigilance contre les ennemis de l'égalité qui essayent d'attaquer cette égalité au nom de la religion. Donc la lettre affirme que les hommes ont utilisé la religion pour dominer la femme, et donc que toutes les femmes qui portent des symboles religieux sont dominées par les hommes, et donc que le choix de porter des symboles religieux ne fait que partie de la fausse conscience. Donc Jeannette Bertrand est un personnage important au Québec, mais son discours, depuis que la lettre a été écrite, réaffirme en fait une généalogie féministe propre au Québec, visée surtout sur les luttes féministes contre la domination masculine, qui refoule en fait les intersections entre l'oppression sur le genre avec le racisme, le classisme, l'oppression et la xénophobie. Donc la diversité dans les personnages qui ont signé la lettre en fait voile le sujet du féminisme qui est un sujet québécois propre. Donc Jeannette Bertrand dit que les femmes musulmanes qui soutiennent la Charte leur donnent une autre façon de résister le port du voile, et que les femmes qui portent le voile sont folles ou manipulées. Elle dit en fait je suis mal à l'aise avec les femmes exploitées par les religions, je voudrais toutes les sortir de là, j'aimerais leur tendre la main et leur dire « faites-vous pas avoir ». C'est exactement le même discours de sauver les femmes des hommes. Et en fait, ce que ce discours crée, c'est une idée que l'égalité a été atteinte au Québec, mais pas dans les autres parties du monde, et pas pour toutes les personnes. Et en fait, que si toutes les femmes avaient l'égalité qu'avaient les femmes québécoises, soi-disant québécoises blanches, que les discours de religion disparaisseraient.
It's so interesting to me, particularly as a feminist and a Muslim, right? Is this whole notion of how, in fact, women's bodies are being targeted. Yes, Sikhs are included in this ban, as are Jewish men, right? But I'm thinking of, I'm thinking particularly of the Hasidic Jews. Many of the women have to actually wear wigs. So what's going to happen there? A wig is going to be allowed, right? But the other thing that's really sort of striking to me is that it's something that I teach and write about all the time. If you want to kill a group, if you want to annihilate a group, one of the first things you do is you take away its women. Yeah, you can take away its women through sort of lures towards assimilation, become like us and become for us, or you can take them away by raping them, genocide. When you take the women away, they can't reproduce because women are the cultural reproducers of the nation.
At the moment, I don't wear hijab, but I feel directly impacted by this because today it's the hijab, it's the kippah, it's the turban, and it's hard to know where something like this would end. And it's to say that it's just about wearing a religious symbol really minimizes the impact that this has on people's lives.
So when I think about the way that the proposed charter is operating, and in a way it has done its work, right? Its ideological work, its political work is being done now as the discussion is transpiring, as people are choosing sides, right, and finding their toeholes of argumentation, those doing it for as well as those doing it against, and I do see that it's in this way it's functioning more as one of those soft tactics of power rather than the more extreme authoritarian version of how power can be exercised. And it makes me think quite a bit of the kind of writing that Etienne Balibar has done. He wrote some very, very good work in the 1980s on what he called neo-racism. And what's interesting, he said, about the contemporary state of racism is that it's not the racism of the 19th century, right? It's not Gobineau, it's not blood, right? It's a different language of racism. And in fact, what he said is that today you find that it becomes the cultural, right? It becomes the ethnicized. It becomes forms of expression that are oriented and organized as though they operate as though they're a kind of nature, right? They operate to present a legible, at least to other people, a legible sense of self, a legible sense of character, a legible sense of essential being. And in fact, he calls this, it's a form of racism without race, right? And I think that this is partly what is going on with this. I think that the proposed charter is one example of the enacting of this particular kind of neo-racism, which often, as Balibar writes, takes place in around discussions of immigration.
But the deepest thing about the Charter is this notion of exclusion, and us and them, right? So we have to ask, who are the us? And why is this thing coming up at this particular moment in time? Why now? Why not before? Bearing in mind that the Charter is just the latest installment of a debate that has been raging here, and that was actually that escalated into a moral panic, which was then dealt with by the state through the commissioning of a commission, basically, a blue ribbon panel, the Bouchard-Taylor Commission, and its then province-wide hearings, which legitimized a tremendous amount of racism.
I think anytime we're hearing terminology like our values, our heritage, it's alarm bells that we should be very concerned about, because it really is an attempt to kind of draw a line in the sand between us, a supposed us, and a them, and that's why we should begin to pay closer attention. The Bouchard-Taylor Commission essentially was a political instrument. It was a bit of a cop-out by the premier at the time, Jean Charte, who, in response to this event that happened in Hérouville, which is about 160 kilometers outside of Montreal, had essentially announced publicly and posted on their municipal website a code of conduct for any immigrants that might be moving to Hérouville. And it was an incredibly xenophobic document, and it wasn't until it actually made international news. It was on the BBC, it was in a New Zealand newspaper as well, but also in Libération in France, that I think most cogently took a position and kind of questioned the framing of the code of conduct that had been stating essentially what the kind of guidelines and behavior that potential immigrants might have. And I mean, it didn't address any issues that would have had any practical pertinence to the ways that people were already living in Hérouville at the time. So I think by basically commissioning Bouchard and Taylor to undertake a kind of town hall approach where they crisscrossed the province for about 3 months, essentially what it created in the media was a hateful, racist discourse in the public sphere that got reported as is in the media. And I think that was the most painful and damaging and violent part of the commission itself. I mean, it took them ages to actually produce, I think it was a 350-page document in the end, but I think Yasmin Jawani and I have looked at the impact itself of creating an event like that in the process, in the province, on a day-to-day kind of basis, because essentially what it did was it sanctioned a racist discourse to circulate in the public sphere repeatedly, and I think even more insidiously, it allowed for a range of type of anxieties that were not only racist but xenophobic, also sexist, to kind of congeal together and be conflated, so that you had issues like kosher food, tax-free cigarettes on native reserves, and the wearing of the hijab to all suddenly be intimately related and part of a conspiracy on the part of people of color and native people to kind of perpetrate and threaten, basically the so-called dominant values of Quebec culture.
One of the things that the Charter does, when I said that it legitimizes forms of violence, is discursive violence, symbolic violence, the very idea of what one can wear or not wear, all right? That's actually a violation of human rights. Violation coming from the violence done to the subject, right? So here, what's happening is that this is state-mandated violence. So it's a violence at the discursive level, it's a violence at the corporeal level in terms of who gets to do whatever they want and who doesn't. It's a violence in terms of the kind of corporeal insignia that's allowed or disallowed, right? But it's a violence that ultimately transcends the discursive realm and actually becomes manifest in the kinds of reactions that people have been leveling at women, primarily women who choose to wear the hijab. So there are stories about women being pushed off the bus. There are stories about women who have gone for coffee and have been told basically that they're not going to be served. And there is actually a group in Quebec, it's called, I think, the Collective Against Islamophobia, that has documented over 117 cases of Islamophobia, just since discussion of the Charter ensued, compared to only something like 25 or cases that had occurred in the months before, since the beginning of this year. So we're in 2013, it's now November. So the Charter sort of debate, what started in late August, early September, in that period of time, 117 incidents. That's just this one organization. So you can imagine how much, and this is recorded, for a person to actually go and say, all right, I've experienced racism, takes a lot. So what about the undocumented cases? What about the everyday racism, right? And the violence of that is undocumented, that is simply passed over, or that, is likely to be trivialized by other people in positions of power who would say, well, you shouldn't take this so seriously.
However, what's interesting about this is that it doesn't create just a divide between the us and them, but it also creates another divide between the them, in that it creates a good them and a bad them. And I use Mahmoud Mamdani's term, where he discusses the good Muslim and the bad Muslim. And I quote from his book entitled Good Muslim, Bad Muslim. Good Muslims are modern, secular, and westernized, but bad Muslims are doctrinal, anti-modern, and virulent. And so this is really relevant with the Charter that is promoting this idea of secularism and promoting this idea of gender equality, as though people part of the Jewish community, the Sikh community, and the Muslim community don't have gender equality already.
Another thing I notice when I look at the graphic is that all the skin tones of all the people featured in the graphic are white. And we know that whiteness is often perceived to be neutral. If it's white, it has no value. And we know very well now, the way the culture works, that whiteness can be very powerful, it can be very invisible, despite the amount of power, even because of the amount of power that accrues to whiteness as a racial category. What we see if we look closely at the graphic is that everybody appears to have the same skin tone, which begs a reading, invites a very certain narrow kind of reading, I think, which is that if only we could take away those religious markers, the yarmulke, the turban, the hijab, if we could take those things away, we would all be the same. And I think that's a very naive view. I think it's a kind of child's eye view of the world. If we just take away these things, we'll all be the same, we'll all be equal. And I think if multiculturalism, I know that's something that's not popular to talk about right now in terms of the framing of this charter, if we think about multiculturalism in its positive sense, there's certainly been a very long-standing critique of the idea of multiculturalism. One of those things is that we should embrace difference, not deny difference, not suppress difference. And I think that's something that's coming through very strongly in the graphic, is if we would take away these apparently trivial differences in terms of dress code associated with religious affiliation, we'll all be the same underneath. And I think that's a really faulty way of thinking about difference in culture.
Oh, yes, the ban on wearing the kippah, the ban on the turban, all of these things are actually a way of keeping the supposed demands of the minorities down. They're a way of saying, we put up with difference up to this point, but we're not going to anymore, right? Either you become like us or get out of here.
These ways of dividing the religious and the secular are fundamentally Christian in their origin. I think it says something very interesting about, of course, what is hidden underneath the larger impulse of this law, which is to preserve the norm of Quebec's largely Christian society, which is a Christianity that is disavowed in many ways as being the mark of what was dangerous about our past, and yet this sort of the very thing that's disavowed, of course, is precisely what is made normative and uncommented upon. So crucifixes get a pass, kippas don't.
There is no groundswell of popular concern in Quebec that the state is no longer neutral, right? It simply has not happened, right? There is no chronology of complaints about not being treated fairly or about unfair bias. There is no groundswell of turning to religiosity in Quebec. It's a thoroughly secular environment and society, and there are a myriad of forms of participation in religious practice. But there has been absolutely no indication of any change that would warrant any particular kind of special debate or special attention that this charter introduces.
One of the things that comes out of this assumption is that there is something called religion that can and should be detached from its outward material manifestations, and that it's the duty of citizens, and in particular agents of the state, to separate their inner conviction from their outward manifestation. This may be a strategy available in some contexts for some religious actors, but it is hardly a universal precept. For one thing, we can all point, and the government and its proponents of the Charter have repeatedly pointed out that there are many Muslims who do not, those Muslim women who are faithful, who do not wear a hijab. There are many Jews who do not wear a kippah. I happen to be one of them. And many other examples of Christians who do not wear ostentatious large crosses and so on. But the assumptions that somehow that religious conviction is essentially this immaterial inner property of the self that not only can but must be separated out from its outer material manifestations becomes again another way in which the state calls upon itself to define the field of the secular, whatever that may be, to define the field of secular as this realm that somehow is evacuated of all these signs, and in so doing it actually defines what religion is in the same breath, to declare that religion and religious affiliation are simply matters of internal conviction, and any other expression, any material manifestation of religious activity is somehow a violation of that essential definition.
I think it's important that the language of neutrality hasn't borne out actually in the responses to the Charter. Those people who support the Charter, in fact, have used language that is far from neutral in defending it. And so when the Jeannettes use words like crazy or manipulated, or they talk about the horror or the being disturbed by being meeting in a government office with a woman who's veiled, the justification of a language of neutrality actually covers over some very affectively charged hate speech. And so who gets to be neutral and then through that neutrality use hate speech against other people highlights the ways in which discomfort marks the privileged citizens of Quebec from those people who are seen as disruptive.
I mean, I think the other strange thing that happened with the Bouchard-Taylor Commission, if I can just go back to the Bouchard-Taylor Commission, was the use of the term reasonable accommodation. And again, it's the human rights lawyer Pearl Eliadis who made a statement at the time back in 2007 that the use of the term reasonable accommodation actually comes out of the Canadian Charter of Human Rights. And it's supposed to be a legal instrument to ensure that people with physical disabilities would have a reasonable form of access to buildings or other types of public transportation in the public sphere. Essentially what happened in the Bouchard-Taylor Commission with the appropriating of reasonable accommodation as a term is it became prescriptive, and it also became about social practices. And now it's stuck. I mean, at the time it was 2007, it's like, why are they even using the term reasonable accommodation? And now it's stuck in our, 6 years later, we're still talking about accommodation. And so even the term accommodation sets out a certain structure of relationships between who is considered to be the dominant culture and who are the, late arrivals, let's say, that somehow have to be the ones that adapt themselves or assimilate in some way, silently and without being noticed in any kind of manner, in Quebec society.
In a way, the proposed charter is an extension, right? It's a continuation of that way of framing a question, right, or that way of framing the debate. And so by essentially asking us to consider what it means to participate in Quebec society, beginning from the point of a reasonable accommodation, what we see is that we're already talking about a presumed place, a presumed coherence of some pre-existing society, some pre-existing stability that in some way is being valued especially highly, and that is being contaminated by some force, some elements that are in some way apart from and at odds with that imagined coherence. So this is where we have to think of things like Raymond Williams' concept of selective tradition, right, where he says that all of the things that we think of as a tradition, right, as a kind of naturalized historical shared features in cultural life, that in fact they're only ever at best a selective tradition. That is, that there are other forces that are facilitating the continuation. And when you see continuation of those practices and ideas and sensibilities and artifacts, and the important thing for the critic would be to identify, well, what are those forces that are facilitating the continuation of certain features against others, right? So it's only ever a selective tradition, right? It's only ever a partial representation, right, of where people have been and where they're going.